There's no question that Brazilian democracy is imperiled. You can't really overstate how dangerous the political climate is when you have a president who has explicitly said for decades that he opposes the very concept of democracy, whose family have threatened repeatedly since he's been elected to do things like shut the Congress, shut down the Supreme Court. So the risk to democracy is very real. It's not just the president, it's his three sons as well, one of whom's a senator, the other of whom is a member of Congress, who's kind of the liaison to the international far right. His other son, who's technically a city councilman in Rio de Janeiro, but is actually the mastermind of the fake news network that the Bolsonaros run. They are all deeply enmeshed, not just in corruption, taking bribes and stuff. They're closely linked to the paramilitary gangs that rule Brazil that are incredibly savage and barbaric. They're composed of ex or even current members of the military, the armed forces, and police. They are like the mafia, but far more barbaric. They carry out murders for hire. They use and exploit their military prowess to carry out crimes without getting caught. They have connections to the police and the military that shield them when they do. It's a really menacing operation that the Bolsonaros are very closely linked to, and there's a lot of scandals that can threaten to put President Bolsonaro's sons and ultimately himself in prison. And a lot of the political strife and conflict in Brazil comes from this attempt by Bolsonaro to protect his family from the mechanisms of law enforcement. When you have that kind of an ethos driving all of this, namely this very autocratic president driven by the incentive to keep his sons out of jail, it is a very volatile situation, to put that mildly.
Eu não vou esperar fuder minha família toda.
You know, it's not just me as a journalist covering Brazil and having done an expose all through last year that was very destabilizing to the Bolsonaro government, showing corruption by what was at the time his most important minister, the Justice Minister, Sergio Moro, but also the fact that my husband is himself a left-wing politician. He's a member of Congress from the Socialist Party, one of only 2 of 600 members of Congress who are openly gay, when the Bolsonaro movement is vehemently anti-gay. It has really put us into kind of a prime target role of the Bolsonaro movement when it comes to their fake news network, threats.
Nós não, o povo, a sociedade brasileira não gosta de homossexual.
In March of 2018, one of our family's best friends, who at the time was my husband's colleague on the Rio de Janeiro City Council before he was elected to Congress, Marielle Franco, who's a black LGBT left-wing activist, was brutally murdered, assassinated on the streets of Rio de Janeiro after an event while riding in the back of her car, carried out by one of those militias closely linked to the Bolsonaros. You know, political violence is a very serious reality in Brazil. It's not just an abstraction. And because of the work he's done, because of the work that I've done, and because of the work that we do jointly, and kind of the symbol that we've become as an openly gay couple with 2 adopted Brazilian children, we've become one of the prime enemies of the Bolsonaro movement that, of course, carries a lot of danger and a lot of risk with it. During the military regime that the US and the UK helped usher in when they toppled the democratically elected government of Brazil in 1964 and then proceeded to rule the country for the next 21 years under a highly repressive regime, stealing the Amazon from the indigenous tribes that have lived there for centuries and that have sovereign rights over it was something that was routinely done. They would just cut down trees, they would mine, they would log. Deforestation was epidemic. And so Bolsonaro comes out of that tradition. He was part of the military regime. I mean, he was a young army captain. He spent the last 30 years advocating that as a superior form of government and chose as his environmental minister this completely deranged extremist, Ricardo Salles, who ran for Congress. His campaign literature showed the Amazon and environmental groups in bullets, essentially saying the answer to environmental activism was that we're just going to shoot them. And then there was a recording that emerged recently within the last 2 months of a cabinet meeting in the Bolsonaro government where the environmental minister said that the focus on the coronavirus is the perfect opportunity to enable us to accelerate Amazon policies that we believe in, namely invading indigenous land, killing or allowing to be killed indigenous leaders, allowing the agribusiness that funded the Bolsonaro campaign in 2018 full range to run roughshod over the Amazon, to burn down trees, to clear lands for cattle, essentially just to exploit the Amazon. Bolsonaro has contempt for the indigenous tribes in Brazil, doesn't believe they're entitled to 1 centimeter of land, as he put it, and that the Amazon is there to exploit and not to protect.
Não vai ter 1 centímetro demarcado para a reserva indígena ou para quilombola.
I think there's now a consensus internationally that as bad as Donald Trump has been, as bad as Boris Johnson has been, Bolsonaro is in a league by himself when it comes to having mismanaged the coronavirus pandemic, not only because he mocked it and minimized it and dismissed it early on, but because he's been opposed on completely non-scientific grounds to every form of social distancing, isolation, quarantine, shutdown. He's encouraged people to go out into crowds. He, of course, himself contracted the virus. Brazil has the highest rate of confirmed cases, as well as the highest death rate of any country in the world, except for the United States.
E daí? Lamento, quer que faça o quê?
Obviously, there's a right-wing ideological similarity, which, among other things, posits that government really doesn't have much of a positive role to play in society, and also is skeptical of the value of science, as we obviously see when it comes to skepticism over climate scenarios. So when you combine those two things, exactly what is most needed when it comes to managing a pandemic, efficient government response plus a belief in science, you have an ideology and power in all three countries to varying degrees that is hostile to exactly the kinds of responses that are most needed, and therefore it should be unsurprising that that ideology is one that has produced the worst results. I don't think any of those three leaders care very much about governance. They kind of like the political battle, not really interested in the mechanics of government, which kind of bore them. And so at exactly the moment when you need competent, involved, engaged leaders to inspire and organize and create the space for a coordinated, effective, unique, novel government response to a novel pathogen, the three leaders who, again, to varying degrees, have very little interest in actual governance, seem to have produced among the worst results, and I don't think that should be particularly surprising.
Temos muita coisa em comum.
Bolsonaro, for all of his horrors and all of his failings, is an effective showman. He's an effective demagogue, not dissimilar to Trump. Bolsonaro has been kind of on the fringes of Brazilian political life. He served for 30 years in the Congress before being elected president. He was never taken seriously, and the way that he rose to prominence was he started going on these TV shows. He was irresistible to TV because he was so outrageous, but also so charismatic that TV loved him, and they turned him into a star. Very similar to how the US media with Trump built him into this figure for their own interest that ultimately ended up converting to political power. For all the failings of Bolsonaro, when you take a population that is very marginalized and deprived, and that is susceptible to a very advanced and sophisticated and well-financed fake news operation, and you add to that an effective political demagogue, it's very difficult to predict Bolsonaro's political demise. Even with the coronavirus, as it kind of ravages poor communities and the economy, he's kind of turning it into an advantage by saying, I told you all along that we can't shut down the economy because if we do, you're going to suffer. He's very adept, very kind of politically agile. And, the elite is always surprised by public opinion polls that show him more or less maintaining his core base, kind of like in the UK, all the sophisticates in Oxbridge kept hearing about how terrible Brexit was, so they were shocked when it passed. Same within the US when Trump beat Hillary. There's a kind of detachment in the elite class from the population that they scorn. And so I think it's very difficult to predict how that detachment will translate into political outcomes. I really encourage you to support on Patreon Double Down News. Independent journalism has never been as important as it is now. Double Down News is devoted to challenging power, to questioning pieties without fear, without constraints, and that's exactly the kind of addition we need more than ever to our discourse, and independent journalism is possible only with your support.